It started with a simple notification, one of those red bubbles that popped up on the corner of my Instagram icon. One new follower. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I was used to getting random followers every now and then, bots, maybe someone from high school I barely remembered, or just strangers who liked one of my posts. But this one was different. The account had no name, just an empty profile picture and a username like random numbers and letters smashed together. Zur 18,354 X's. No bio, no posts, no mutual followers. Just that vague, unsettling presence in my list. Normally, I'd ignore it or block it, but curiosity got the better of me this time. I clicked on it. Nothing, completely empty, not even a following list, just zeros across the board. I shrugged it off and went about my day, scrolling through my feed, liking pictures, leaving a comment or two. But later that evening, I noticed something odd. My post count. It said I had one more post than I actually remembered posting. But there it was. A new post that I definitely didn't upload. It was a picture of me sitting at my desk, staring into my phone. The angle was wrong though. It wasn't a selfie. It looked like someone had taken the picture from across the room. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at it, trying to figure out where it could have come from. I live alone. No one had been in my apartment all day, and there were no mirrors nearby that could have reflected this angle. I tried to delete it, but the app wouldn't let me. Every time I hit the delete button, my phone froze for a second, and then the picture would just stay. Panic began creeping in as I frantically checked my entire apartment. I locked every door and window, pulled the blinds, and sat down with my phone again. The follower was still there. And now I had more notifications. Zur 18,354X liked your post. Zur 18,354X commented, "Nice pic." My heart pounded as I opened the post. Sure enough, there was a comment. But it wasn't just the typical nice pic I expected. There were more instructions. "Go to the kitchen," the comment read. "There's something waiting for you." I got up slowly and walked toward the kitchen. As I approached, a faint scratching sound began to echo from within. It was soft at first, like something scurrying, and then grew louder, more insistent. The lights in the kitchen flickered as I stepped in, and then I saw it. A note. Just a small, crumpled piece of paper lying on the counter. I unfolded it with shaking hands. Scribbled in jagged handwriting were the words, "Check your DMs." I rushed back to my phone, heart racing, and opened Instagram. Sure enough, I had a new message request. It was from Zur 18,354X. My hand hovered over the screen for a moment, dread settling in my stomach. But I clicked it. The message was a video file. I didn't want to watch it. Every part of me screamed to shut my phone off, throw it away, leave the apartment. But I couldn't. Something compelled me to press play. The video was dark at first, just the sound of heavy breathing, like whoever was filming was trying to stay quiet. And then the camera panned up to a door, my door. I dropped the phone, backing away as my mind raced. This wasn't happening. Someone was outside. Someone was here. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, heart pounding so loud I could barely think. The phone buzzed again. Another DM. "Look outside." I didn't want to. God, I didn't want to. But I had to. I crept toward the window, hands trembling, and pulled the blinds aside just a crack. There was nothing. Just the dark, empty street, lit by the dull orange glow of the streetlights. No one was there. Relief flooded me for a moment, but it was quickly interrupted by another buzz, another message. "I'm closer than you think." The lights flickered again, and then went out completely. I stood in total darkness, my phone the only source of light, its screen glowing dimly in my hand. The notifications kept coming, one after another, rapid fire. "Nice place. Behind you." I spun around, the knife shaking in my hand, but there was nothing. Just the shadows creeping around the corners of the room, stretching as the light from my phone flickered. The final message came through, chilling me to the core. "Check your camera roll." My fingers barely worked as I swiped over to my Photos app. There, sitting in my camera roll, was a new picture. It was me, standing in the darkness, holding the knife, staring wide-eyed into the phone. But behind me, just barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. Its face was hidden, but the outline was unmistakable. It was standing so close, just inches away. Another buzz. "Don't worry, I'm always watching, and I'm not alone." I tried to shut the phone off, but it wouldn't respond. The screen flickered, and then more followers started flooding in. Dozens, hundreds, all with usernames like random strings of numbers and letters, all with empty profiles. The last thing I saw before my phone screen went black was the notification. Zur 18354X started a live video. I was tagged in it. And when I heard the knock at my door, I realized I wasn't the only one watching. The sound of knocking grew louder, echoing off the walls of my apartment. Panic surged through me, and I pressed myself against the wall, knife gripped tightly in my hand. The shadows around me seemed to deepen, cloaking me in fear. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus. What was I going to do? Should I call the police? I glanced at my phone, hoping to find a way to escape this nightmare. But it was dead, black and lifeless, just as the screen had gone out. The knocking stopped for a moment, leaving an eerie silence that felt heavy in the air. Then the voice came again, low and menacing. "Open up, I just want to talk." My blood ran cold. It was the same voice from the video, distorted, echoing through the wood of the door. I stepped back, heart racing. I didn't want to know who it was. I didn't want to confront whatever horror had invaded my life. "Just a joke, right?" I called out, my voice trembling. "You got what you wanted, just leave me alone." But there was no response, just the unsettling silence that filled the room. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my laptop had powered on. The screen glowed eerily in the darkness, and as I glanced at it, my heart sank. The webcam light was on. With dread pooling in my stomach, I leaned closer. The live video was running, and there were dozens of comments pouring in. "Let us in," one read. "We want to see you," another echoed. I felt bile rise in my throat. I hadn't just been tagged, I was being broadcasted. They could see me. Desperate, I grabbed a pillow and threw it over the webcam, hoping to block the view, but it didn't matter. They'd already seen me, and they were already there. The comments continued to flood in, demanding to see me, demanding my presence. Suddenly the knocking resumed, harder this time, accompanied by a loud voice yelling, "Let me in." I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, searching for an escape. I couldn't stay in the apartment. I needed to get out. I moved silently, trying to avoid the creaking floorboards. The knocking intensified, as if they sensed my hesitation. Just as I reached for the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. My heart raced as I turned to see a figure slipping through the broken window, silhouetted against the dim light of the street outside. It was a person, their face obscured by shadows, but they moved with a sickening confidence. I could hear them breathing heavily, their footsteps deliberate as they approached. "Stop!" I shouted, brandishing the knife. "Get away from me!" The figure paused, tilting their head, and I saw the glint of their eyes in the darkness. They stepped closer, and I could see their mouth curve into a grin. "You should have listened." Before I could react, they lunged at me. I swung the knife wildly, adrenaline coursing through me, but the figure was too quick. They grabbed my wrist, twisting it painfully. The knife fell to the floor with a clatter, and I felt the cold air rush around me as they pushed me back against the wall. "Don't be scared," they said, their voice low and taunting. "We just want to play." I struggled, but it was futile. There was a growing crowd outside, the faint sound of voices whispering my name. "Let us in," they chanted, growing louder and more insistent. "Let us in." They were waiting for me. "Welcome back," one of them shouted, a voice that felt strangely familiar, almost comforting in its madness. I turned, panic igniting within me, but it was too late. They surged forward, engulfing me in darkness, the last shred of light disappearing as they closed in. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the growing chorus of their laughter, echoing in my mind. The last thing I remembered was the suffocating feeling of being pulled into the crowd, the relentless surge of followers, each one with that same empty profile, all eager to join the game. In the quiet aftermath, my phone lay on the floor, now lit up with a new notification. "You've got new followers." The screen flickered, displaying countless empty profiles with the same string of letters and numbers, their comments a haunting reminder of the darkness that had consumed me. The cycle would continue, and somewhere out there, another unsuspecting soul would feel the tap of an unseen follower.
It all began with the new school year. I was a junior in high school, a year when everything seemed to matter more. The pressure to maintain my grades was overwhelming, but I was determined to excel. On the first day back, we were introduced to our new math teacher, Mr. Hargrove. He was unlike any teacher I had ever encountered. He had a peculiar aura about him. His eyes seemed to pierce right through you, and there was an unsettling grin that never quite left his face. As the weeks rolled on, the assignments piled up. But it was in Mr. Hargrove's class that things began to take a dark turn. Each week, we were given an assignment that seemed more complicated than the last. It was never just homework. It felt like a twisted puzzle that had to be solved perfectly. The stakes felt high, but I was determined to keep up. One Wednesday afternoon, after yet another brutal day of lessons, I sat in my room staring at my latest assignment. It was a seemingly simple problem involving quadratic equations, but the more I worked, the more frustrated I became. It was as if the numbers danced on the page, refusing to cooperate. As I scratched my head in confusion, I heard a strange noise, like a whisper coming from the shadows of my room. I dismissed it as my imagination, but a shiver ran down my spine. Just then, my phone buzzed. I picked it up to find a message from an unknown number. "Need help? I can assist." I hesitated, but finally replied, asking who it was. "Just a friend who knows math. Let me help you." Curiosity got the better of me. I clicked the link they sent and opened a chat window. They started guiding me through the assignment, explaining concepts I had struggled with. The numbers fell into place and I felt a rush of relief. I thanked them profusely, and as I turned to save my work, a chilling thought struck me. I didn't even know who I was talking to. The next day in class, Mr. Hargrove announced a new policy. From now on, each student would be assigned a homework buddy to collaborate with on assignments. I glanced around the room, scanning for a partner. My friend Sarah sat next to me, her eyes wide with fear. She whispered, "I heard that if you don't do your homework perfectly, something terrible happens." I dismissed her fears, thinking it was just another urban legend to scare students. That was until I overheard a group of students talking after class. They were discussing a girl from the previous year who had vanished after failing a math assignment. The air in the room turned thick with dread, but I shook it off as nonsense. That night, as I sat down to tackle another assignment, my phone buzzed again. The same unknown number reached out, offering help once more. I felt a twinge of unease, but the prospect of acing the homework was too tempting. We chatted for hours, and by the end of it, I felt confident about my understanding. I finished the assignment and submitted it just before midnight, but something felt off. The next day, I walked into math class, expecting Mr. Hargrove to praise my efforts. Instead, he glared at me, his face twisted in anger. "This is unacceptable," he sneered, waving my paper in the air. "You think you can submit something so mediocre?" My heart sank. I had spent hours on that assignment, and I felt my stomach twist in knots as the rest of the class stared at me, confusion and fear etched on their faces. Mr. Hargrove continued, "You'll find out what happens when you disappoint me. Prepare for the worst." The class erupted into whispers. "What does he mean? What happens when you disappoint him?" I tried to shake it off, but dread hung heavy in the air. As I left class, I caught sight of Sarah. "Are you okay?" she asked, worry flickering in her eyes. I shook my head. "Not really. He's acting insane." That night, I received another message from the unknown number. "Did you submit your work? Are you sure it's perfect?" I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I responded, "Yes, I think so. You should double check. You don't want to be the next victim." I didn't sleep that night. I went over my homework searching for mistakes. Every equation looked correct, but anxiety gnawed at me. I had to make sure everything was perfect. I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to me. The next day, I returned to class with a pit in my stomach. My mind raced as I watched Mr. Hargrove collect our assignments. My heart pounded in my chest as he scanned through the papers, an ominous grin spreading across his face. "Very well," he said, pausing dramatically. "I have chosen one of you to be the example. a reminder of what happens when you don't take my assignments seriously. My blood ran cold. The other students looked around, fear and confusion spreading like wildfire. "Sarah," he called out, and I felt a chill race through me. Sarah's face paled. "What did I do?" she asked, panic rising in her voice. Mr. Hargrove leaned closer, a twisted smile on his lips. "You failed to meet my expectations. There are consequences for that." Just then the lights flickered. The air grew thick with tension as the class held its breath. "Please, no," Sarah pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. But it was too late. The classroom door slammed shut, trapping us inside. Mr. Hargrove's eyes glinted with madness. "You think this is just about math? You're all part of something greater. Each wrong answer carries a price." As he spoke, the shadows in the room began to stretch, enveloping Sarah. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. "Get back!" I shouted, but I was frozen in fear. The rest of the class backed away, and the room felt suffocating. When the shadows receded, Sarah was gone. The class erupted into chaos. "What just happened?" I gasped, backing away from the teacher. Mr. Hargrove's grin only widened. "This is just the beginning. You'll all learn that I don't tolerate failure, and I will be watching." We were dismissed, but as I left the classroom, a dark cloud settled over me. I felt a heaviness in my chest, knowing the danger wasn't over. I had to escape this nightmare. I rushed home, and as soon as I walked through the door, my phone buzzed again. "You need to submit your homework again. Perfect it." This time I didn't hesitate. I blocked the number and deleted the app. I wouldn't let it control me anymore. The following days passed in a haze of paranoia. I stopped seeing friends, skipping school to avoid Mr. Hargrove's twisted games. But even in my isolation, the fear lingered. I'd catch glimpses of shadows moving at the corners of my vision, hear whispers echoing through my empty house. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront Mr. Hargrove. I returned to the school, sneaking into the building. The halls were eerily quiet as I approached his classroom. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear him muttering to himself inside. "Just a little more, and they'll understand," he said. "This is for their own good." I pushed the door open slowly. The classroom was dimly lit, and Mr. Hargrove was standing in front of the board, scribbling equations furiously. "What do you want?" he snapped, turning to face me, his eyes wild. "I want to know why you're doing this. Why did you take Sarah?" His face twisted into a deranged smile. "Because she didn't understand the stakes. It's a lesson for all of you. Only those who excel will survive." Survive? This isn't survival. This is madness. "Madness is the price of failure," he said, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "And it's coming for you next." I took a step back, panic setting in. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. The shadows in the room seemed to grow, twisting and warping around me. "Help!" I screamed, but my voice echoed back, drowning in the darkness. I felt the cold grip of the shadows wrap around me. Just as they pulled me into their embrace, I thought I heard a familiar voice calling out, "Don't let them take you! Fight back!" In that moment, I remembered the math problems. The equations I had struggled with were not just numbers. They were my escape. I focused on the formulas, the concepts, recalling everything I had learned. With a burst of determination, I shouted into the darkness, "I refuse to fail!" Suddenly, the shadows recoiled, releasing their grip. The lights flickered back on, and I found myself standing alone in the classroom, Mr. Hargrove nowhere to be found. But the relief was short-lived. My phone buzzed one last time. "You may have escaped, but you can never truly leave. I will always be watching." The message sent a chill down my spine. As I fled the school, I knew this wasn't over. The weight of the homework, the dread of Mr. Hargrove, and the whispers of lost souls would haunt me forever. And as I looked back at the darkened windows of the school, I understood the truth. Homework wasn't just about grades. It was a sinister game that demanded perfection. And in this twisted world, failure came with a terrible price. It started the summer after my father died. We'd always been a small farming family living on the outskirts of a sleepy town no one ever talked about. The kind of place where people kept to themselves, in secret stayed buried with the seasons. My father had run the farm for as long as I could remember. Every morning before dawn, he'd be out there in the fields, tending to the crops, mending fences, or fixing up the barn. He was a man of the earth, never complaining about the long hours or the backbreaking work. After he passed, the farm fell to me. I did my best to keep things going, though I was nowhere near the man my father had been. It was just me and my mother now. She was frail, sickly. It had been a long time since she could help around the house, let alone the farm. So I did what I could, though each day felt heavier than the last. Our fields stretched far and wide, a sea of corn that swayed with the wind like golden waves. At the far edge of the property, just before the line of dark woods, was the scarecrow. It had been there for as long as I could remember. Old, faded, and weather-beaten, it stood watch over the fields. It had an air of sadness about it, slouched forward as if the weight of the years had become too much. My father had made it when I was a boy, burlap sack for a head, stuffed with straw, with 2 black buttons sewn on for eyes. A thick rope stitched its mouth shut, and its arms were outstretched on a wooden cross, dressed in one of my father's old flannel shirts, now torn and sun-bleached. I never thought much about it. Just a scarecrow, nothing more. But after Dad was gone, strange things began happening on the farm. It started small, little things at first, things I could brush off or explain away. I'd leave my tools in the barn, only to find them scattered in the field the next day. Fences I'd mended the night before would be torn apart by morning, boards pulled clean out of the ground. Sometimes I'd hear strange noises at night, creaking, like something heavy shifting in the dark, or the faint rustle of corn stalks when there wasn't a breeze. Then the footsteps started. One night I was lying in bed, the windows open to let in the cool night air. The farm was quiet, the only sound the distant rustling of the corn. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it, a slow, deliberate crunching of gravel, like someone walking just outside. My eyes shot open and I lay there, heart pounding, straining to hear. The sound grew closer, each step heavier than the last before stopping just below my window. I sat up, throat dry, waiting for something, anything. But after a few agonizing moments, it stopped. Just silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. Farm life was full of critters after dark after all. But the next night the footsteps came again, and this time they didn't stop. I shot up and rushed to the window, peering out into the yard, but there was nothing. The moonlight cast long shadows across the field, and everything was still. No footsteps, no sign of anyone or anything. It wasn't until the 3rd night that I saw it. I'd been waiting, sitting by the window with a flashlight clutched in my hand. The house was dead silent, the only sound the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Just after midnight, the footsteps came, slow, deliberate, crunching across the gravel once again. My heart raced, and I flicked on the flashlight, casting the beam toward the yard. There, standing at the edge of the field, was the scarecrow. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The scarecrow was supposed to be at the far end of the field, propped up on its post, but now it stood in the yard, hunched forward like it was studying me. Its button eyes gleamed in the light, reflecting back at me, and for a moment I thought they moved. Just slightly, as if following the beam of light. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes. This had to be a trick of the light. Maybe a prank. Kids from town messing with me. I stared at the scarecrow for what felt like hours, waiting for it to move, to do something. But it just stood there, motionless, its ragged clothes flapping in the faint breeze. The next morning, the scarecrow was back on its post, slouched as always, the wooden cross swaying in the wind. I checked the yard, but there were no footprints, no sign anyone had been there. Days passed, and I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I was just tired. Grief messes with your mind. But every night the footsteps returned, and every night the scarecrow would be a little closer. First at the edge of the field, then halfway to the house. It never moved when I was watching, but each morning it was back on its post, like nothing had ever happened. The animals were the first to sense it. The cows refused to leave the barn, huddling in the far corner, their eyes wide and frightened. The chickens stopped laying eggs, and more than a few were found dead in their coop, their necks twisted at odd angles, their beady eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Even the crops began to wither, despite my best efforts. The soil felt wrong beneath my feet, cold and damp even in the heat of summer. I tried to ignore it. I threw myself into the work, hoping that if I kept busy, I could forget about the scarecrow and the footsteps. But it was impossible to shake the feeling that something was watching me, always watching, waiting for something. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, expecting to see it standing there, just out of sight. One evening, as I was finishing up the chores, I glanced toward the edge of the field. The scarecrow was there again, but it had moved closer, its arms hanging limply at its sides. The post it had once been tied to stood empty behind it, swaying gently in the breeze. My stomach dropped. I approached cautiously, heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I noticed something was wrong with its face. The burlap was sagging, the stitches pulling tight, as if something inside was stretching the fabric. The button eyes seemed darker, gleaming with a malicious glint that hadn't been there before. And its mouth, oh God, its mouth. The rope stitching had loosened, the threads fraying, and beneath them, something wet and dark gleamed in the faint light of the setting sun. I turned to run, but the sound of rustling stopped me in my tracks. I turned back and froze in horror. The scarecrow had taken a step forward. The ground beneath my feet felt like it was sinking, the soil wet and soft, pulling me down with every breath. I could hear the corn rustling, louder now, like something moving through the stalks. A whispering, soft but persistent, carried on the wind. You belong to the field. I ran back to the house, heart hammering in my chest, locking every door and window. The footsteps followed me, growing louder, closer. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the shotgun in my lap, staring out the window, waiting for the scarecrow to appear. At dawn, I ventured outside. The air was thick with fog, the world eerily quiet. I half expected to find the scarecrow standing at my door, but the yard was empty. The only sign of life was the long shadow it cast from the far end of the field, where it had returned to its post. I thought about leaving, packing up and abandoning the farm, but I couldn't. Every time I tried to drive down the old dirt road, the engine would stall, or I'd feel a pull, like the very land was holding me in place, refusing to let me go. And every night, the scarecrow moved closer. First, it was at the field's edge, then the middle of the yard. Each time, a little closer. Each time, that sick, twisted smile on its burlap face grew wider, the stitches tearing more and more, until I swore I could see teeth, human teeth, beneath the burlap. Tonight, it's standing right outside my window, its button eyes pressed against the glass, the stitched grin stretched wide across its face. I can hear it whispering again, louder this time. You belong to the field. I think I understand now. The farm, it's not just land. It's alive and it's hungry. My father must have known. He must have made a deal with it long ago, a pact to keep the crops growing, to keep the land thriving. And now with him gone, it's come for me. The scarecrow was never just a scarecrow. It was a guardian, a warning. But now it's too late. I can feel it, the pull of the field. The ground beneath me is soft, wet, and sinking. I can't leave. I belong to the field now, and soon I'll be the one watching. I'll never forget the last time I went to Haven Springs Spa. In a small town, known more for its nature trails and quaint shops, Haven Springs was a hidden gem for those who knew where to look. It wasn't flashy or modern like the big city spas, but it had a certain old-world charm. It had been around for decades, nestled between a thick pine forest and a quiet river that wound its way through the valley. The building was an old converted mansion, sprawling and eerie in a way I never really noticed until after what happened. I had been going there for years, always enjoying the way it felt like a sanctuary from the stresses of life. The moment you stepped inside, the world outside seemed to melt away. There were no windows in the massage rooms or steam areas, just soft, dim lighting, calming music, and the smell of lavender and eucalyptus that hung heavy in the air. The owners claimed that the spa had special healing properties due to the natural springs running beneath the building. Some people swore by it, saying that a single visit could rejuvenate you, heal old injuries, and even lift your spirits in a way nothing else could. I didn't put much stock in that sort of thing, but I couldn't deny that it worked wonders for me. After a stressful week, a few hours at Haven Springs would leave me feeling like a new person. So when I saw they were offering a new exclusive treatment package called the Restoration Ritual, I couldn't resist booking it. The spa was known for having unusual treatments, mud baths, salt scrubs, and obscure massages that you couldn't find anywhere else. But this one was different. The brochure promised a once-in-a-lifetime experience, designed to rejuvenate the body, mind, and soul. It was pricey, but I figured if it was anything like their other treatments, it would be worth every penny. The day of my appointment, the sky was a dull gray, the clouds hanging heavy with the threat of rain. It felt unusually cold for late autumn, and the wind that whipped through the trees as I drove up the long, winding road to the spa gave me an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. But I told myself it was just nerves. I was excited for the treatment after all. When I arrived, the place seemed emptier than usual. There were only a few cars in the gravel lot, and the building felt quieter than I remembered. The receptionist, a pale woman I'd never seen before, greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She handed me a white robe and slippers and directed me to the changing rooms, her voice flat and monotone. The usual staff, people I'd come to know by name, weren't there. Instead, there were new faces everywhere, all wearing the same expressionless, hollow look. Something about it unnerved me, but I tried to brush it off. People came and went from places like this all the time. I was just being paranoid. The first part of the restoration ritual was a mineral soak in one of the spa's private bathhouses, a small room with a large marble tub filled with steaming water. The water had a faint metallic smell, something I hadn't noticed during my other visits. The woman who escorted me in said it was from the natural springs below the building, that the minerals were part of what made Haven Springs special. I nodded and slipped into the tub, the heat immediately relaxing my muscles. The woman gave me a small smile before leaving the room, shutting the heavy wooden door behind her. I lay there for what must have been an hour, the warm water soothing every ache and tension in my body. But after a while, I started to feel strange. At first, it was just a vague discomfort, like the air was getting heavier, thicker. Then the room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. The heat that had felt so good earlier now felt oppressive, almost suffocating. I sat up in the tub, my skin prickling with goosebumps despite the warmth. That's when I noticed the water. It wasn't clear anymore. The surface had grown murky, the once soft scent of minerals now tinged with something sour, metallic. I leaned closer, squinting, and realized that the water wasn't just murky. It was dark, too dark, almost black. A sudden panic gripped me, and I scrambled to get out of the tub. My hands slipped on the slick edges, and I nearly fell as I pulled myself up, water sloshing onto the floor. I grabbed the towel hanging by the door and wrapped it around myself, breathing hard. My heart was racing, but I didn't know why. It was just water, right? Maybe they added some new minerals to the treatment, something I wasn't used to. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was all part of the experience, but the unease clung to me as I dressed and headed to the next part of the ritual. The steam room. The hallway leading to the steam rooms was long, dimly lit, and colder than it should have been. The soft music that usually played in the background was absent, replaced by a low, humming sound that seemed to come from the very walls. As I walked, I realized that I hadn't seen another guest since I'd arrived. No one passing in the halls, no one lounging in the common areas, just the new staff, watching me with their two wide eyes and those same thin, empty smiles. When I entered the steam room, a blast of warm, moist air hit me, instantly fogging my vision. The room was thick with steam, so much that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus and something else, something damp and earthy, like rotting leaves. I found a bench in the corner and sat down, trying to relax, but the strange smell kept nagging at me. After a few minutes, I heard the door open. I squinted through the mist, expecting to see another guest, but there was no one there. The door closed again with a soft click, leaving me alone in the thick fog. The room seemed quieter now, the air heavier than it had been before. I tried to shake the growing feeling of dread and lean back against the wall, closing my eyes. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, almost inaudible at first, like someone breathing just behind me. My eyes snapped open, but the room was empty. The whisper came again, soft, unintelligible, but close, too close. I shot up from the bench, heart pounding. The steam clung to my skin, thick and suffocating. I moved toward the door, but the whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices now, rising in pitch. They were all around me, coming from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor beneath my feet. I fumbled for the door handle, my hands slick with sweat. The whispering turned into a low, guttural chant, words I couldn't understand, but felt deep in my bones. Finally, I yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. The hallway was darker now, the low humming sound from earlier replaced by a slow, rhythmic thudding, like a heartbeat pulsing through the walls. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, but the air felt thick, heavy with a strange, acrid smell. My skin itched, and when I looked down, I saw faint, red marks, like scratches, on my arms and legs. I turned to head back to the front desk, to demand an explanation for whatever the hell was happening. But when I reached the main lobby, it was empty. No receptionist, no staff, no one. The soft, ambient music had stopped completely, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I rushed to the front doors, but they wouldn't budge. The glass, which usually allowed a view of the peaceful woods outside, was now dark, as if night had fallen without me noticing. Panic clawed at my throat as I banged on the door, shouting for anyone to hear, but my voice sounded muffled, swallowed by the thick air around me. That's when I felt it, a presence behind me, cold and oppressive, like a shadow that moved without light. I didn't want to turn around, but something compelled me to, like an invisible hand gripping my spine and forcing me to face it. Standing at the far end of the lobby was a figure. At first, I thought it was one of the staff, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized it wasn't human, at least not anymore. Its skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over a gaunt, skeletal frame. The eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream, revealing a gaping void where its throat should have been. The figure moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its bare feet leaving wet, dark stains on the floor as it walked. I backed away, my legs trembling, but there was nowhere to go. The doors were locked, the windows dark. The air around me thickened, and the chanting I'd heard in the steam room returned, louder and more insistent. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor as the figure loomed over me. Its hand reached out, long, bony fingers stretching toward my face. I could smell the rot on its breath, feel the cold radiating from its skin. Then everything went black. I woke up hours later, or at least, I think it was hours. I was lying on a massage table, wrapped in a warm towel, the soft sound of ambient music playing in the background. The lights were soft and dim, and the familiar scent of lavender filled the air. For a brief moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a vivid nightmare brought on by stress. But when I sat up, I saw the scratches on my arms, the faint red lines that hadn't been there before. The lobby was still empty, the spa deathly quiet. I left without looking back, abandoning my robe and slippers in the hallway as I bolted for the door. This time, it opened easily, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. I never went back to Haven Springs after that. I don't know what happened in that spa or what they were trying to do with their restoration ritual, but I still have the marks to prove it wasn't just my imagination. Some places are meant to stay hidden, and some treatments aren't worth the price. You never really know when your big break will come. That's what everyone in Hollywood says. For me, it was starting to feel like it never would. I had been grinding for years, bouncing between auditions, barely surviving on bit parts in low-budget films and the occasional commercial. I wasn't picky, I was hungry. I just needed one chance to prove myself, one role that would finally get my name out there. Then I got the call. My agent, Susan, sounded more excited than I'd ever heard her. "Ethan, you've got a shot, a real one," she said, her voice crackling with energy. "There's a director, big time, but kind of mysterious. He's casting for the lead in his next project, and he specifically asked for someone unknown. It's a psychological thriller, big budget, A-list cast, but they want fresh talent for the lead, and he asked for you." I couldn't believe it. My heart pounded as I gripped my phone, listening to the details. The project was so secretive, even the title was under wraps. Susan didn't have much information about the director. Apparently, he was a recluse, someone who preferred to work outside the Hollywood system. No social media presence, no press interviews. All I knew was that he had a reputation for making intense, immersive films, the kind that critics adored and audiences couldn't stop talking about. "I don't know how he heard of you, but this could be your shot. The audition's tomorrow," Susan said. "Don't blow it." The next day, I found myself standing outside a small, unmarked building deep in the Hollywood Hills. The place didn't look like much, more like an old mansion than anything resembling a casting office. But I figured that's how these high-end projects worked. They like to keep things quiet, private. Inside, a woman greeted me. She didn't give her name, just led me through a maze of dimly lit hallways until we reached a small, bare room. No casting couch, no camera crew, just a single old-fashioned film camera in the corner and a chair in the middle of the room. There was no one else there. The woman gestured for me to sit and left without a word. "Yes," I whispered. The room went silent. The camera whirred, and the door finally creaked open. The woman from earlier stood there, her expression blank, and motioned for me to follow her. The shooting started a week later. I didn't get a script, just vague directions and cryptic notes from the director, who I still hadn't met in person. Everything was filmed on location at a sprawling, decaying mansion on the outskirts of the city. The place looked abandoned, covered in ivy and rot, but it was perfect for the dark, gritty tone of the movie. The scenes we filmed were unlike anything I'd ever done. They didn't feel scripted. There were no second takes, no reshoots. Everything was captured in long, uninterrupted shots, the camera always following, always watching. I wasn't acting so much as living in the world the director had created, improvising my way through the narrative without knowing where it would lead. At first, it was exhilarating. The other actors were method, fully committed to their roles, never breaking character. I barely spoke to them off set, but during scenes they were intense, so much so that I started to lose track of what was real and what wasn't. There were moments when I wasn't sure if I was Ethan the actor or the character I was playing. The strangest part was the lack of a crew. It was always just me, the other actors, and the ever-present camera, which seemed to move on its own, always catching the perfect angle. I assumed it was controlled remotely, but no one ever explained how it worked. The director was never on set, though his voice would occasionally crackle over hidden speakers, guiding us through scenes. As the days wore on, things started to get unsettling. The mansion itself felt alive, its long corridors twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Rooms I had been in earlier would disappear, replaced by new ones I'd never seen. The windows were always dark, no matter the time of day, and the air inside was thick with a smell I couldn't place, something damp, decaying. The scenes became darker, more violent. There was one where I had to confront another character in the basement of the mansion. The script, or what little of it I had, said it was a confrontation, nothing more. But when the cameras rolled, something changed. The actor playing the other character looked at me with eyes full of genuine terror. I could see his hands shaking as he reached for a knife. Not a prop, but a real gleaming blade. My body moved on its own, like I was possessed, and before I knew it, I had grabbed the knife from him. The fear in his eyes turned to horror as I raised the blade, my own reflection gleaming in the metal. His screams echoed in my ears as I brought it down, again and again, blood spraying across the walls. When it was over, I stood there, gasping, my hands trembling. The other actor lay on the floor, motionless, the life drained from his eyes. I waited for someone to call cut, for someone to explain that it was just an elaborate special effect, but no one did. I wasn't acting anymore. This was real. My mind raced. I told myself it had to be a mistake, a hallucination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The director's voice crackled over the speaker. "Perfect," he said, his tone dripping with satisfaction. "You're becoming him, Ethan. You're becoming the character." I dropped the knife, stumbling back. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The mansion had swallowed me whole. There was no escape. The film wasn't just a role, it was real. The mansion, the killings. It was all part of some twisted reality the director had created, and I was trapped in it. I don't know how long I stayed there, filming scene after scene, losing more and more of myself with each passing day. The lines between reality and fiction blurred until they were indistinguishable. I wasn't Ethan anymore. I wasn't even sure if Ethan had ever existed. The last scene we shot was in the same room where it all started, the camera whirring in the corner, the air thick with that familiar decay. I stood in the middle of the room, staring into the lens, and for the first time, I heard the director's voice, not over a speaker, but behind me. "Congratulations, Ethan," he said, stepping into view. His face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow, like they'd seen things no human should. "You've given the performance of a lifetime." I looked down at my hands, stained with blood. Whether it was mine or someone else's, I didn't know anymore. The camera whirred to a stop and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, the morning sunlight streaming through the window. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Susan. "Congrats, Ethan. The film's getting rave reviews. You did it." I stared at the message, my hands trembling. I didn't remember coming home. I didn't remember leaving the mansion. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never be free of that role. The mansion, the killings, the director, they weren't part of some twisted film. They were real, and they had consumed me. And now, wherever I went, whatever I did, the camera was still watching.